It's good to see so many people here. I'm a little dull today, having just come back from Moscow. First meal I had there, I got food poisoning. I went from India to Moscow, and from Moscow to Hong Kong, each place staying a couple of days. I thought that, people think I catch it in India. No. I know India fairly well. I go there 4 or 5 times a year. I know what's happening there. I only eat in certain places. So it is not Indian bug. It's Russian bug. And ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, it is every bit as tough. Okay. Anyway, we're delighted to have such a great panel here. This panel is on the China's trajectory and its implication to Asia and to the rest of the world. I know that some of them have prepared some remarks, but I've decided to cut them short. I said, oh, you're more than welcome, but no more than half a minute. And the idea is to be a little bit more interactive beforehand. I was able to communicate in the last couple of weeks with each one of them. And the questions, I asked them to suggest issues and questions that they'd like to see addressed. And I think that it really groups into 3 areas very, very well. But before that, let me, first of all, introduce very quickly just a sentence or two about each individual. Starting with my good friend here, immediately to my right, Professor Mingkang. There are many Chinese government officials. There are very few that I know well enough to really respect. And Professor Liu is certainly one that I really have tremendous amount of respect. That is, while he was in government, and now he is out of government. I just don't understand, Professor Liu, how on earth that your generation, we're about the same age, I assume, 60, slightly above, you started approaching 70. Well, we're all approaching 70, so anyway. That generation of Chinese really baffles me. They don't have the history and background like some of us do. I grew up with J.P. Morgan, right? Whether I like it, I don't like it, I like it. But anyway, I grew up with the thinking, the banking regulatory system. And so I think it's very important that people who grew up in a certain environment gets it, and other people who grew up in another environment don't get it. Right? For example, some of my friends in Southeast Asia, I will not mention which country, they're really honorable, good people. But because of the background from which they rise, that they never get it. In terms of, for example, like governance. It's not that they're not intelligent. Many of them, Jing, are Harvard, Stanford graduates, Xiaogang, right? Columbia, wherever. But somehow it's hardwired into them from youth that they just don't get governance. And yet there are some, not too many, in the mainland of China who grew up in a totally different environment. Although you did go to University of London, but the upbringing, it really determines a lot, in my opinion. And yet not only do they get it, they become the best at it, and is able to manage a whole system, such as in the case of Professor Liu, managing the China Banking and Regulatory Commission as the first chairman of that institution, and run it in such a way that the whole world respects. I think that is something truly amazing. Some other time, I'd like to have a personal interview with you instead of talking about whatever topic that Gucho wanted me to talk about, China trajectory and all that stuff, right? Jonathan, many of you know he lived in Shanghai or Beijing or Shanghai for 15 years with McKinsey, one of the most respected consulting firm in the world, and surely with a Western perspective, living in China for so long, if you live there in 15 months, I won't talk to you. You live in 15 years, then I think you begin to become an expert, the likes of which are very rare. Jing, sorry to make fun of your Harvard and Stanford connection. Jing is a very senior banker, as we all know, from J.P. Morgan. Of course, I'm always worried about women that are very, very smart and happen to be very, very tall and beautiful. But anyway, that's another issue. And then Professor Xiaogang is another longtime friend of mine. Many of you know that he too, after living and growing up in China, lived in Hong Kong for what, 20 years now roughly, has been doing a lot of things for Columbia University, for Tsinghua, and Brookings, and now with Fung Global Institute. By the way, I think Fung Global Institute is a great organization that Hong Kong needs more of. So I think you're doing a good job coming back to Hong Kong. The questions that each of them presented to me basically are in the following category. Jing, being a banker, obviously, she has to advise bank clients such as myself. So she's very strong in numbers and facts, and so rather quantitative in the questions that she gave me. Xiaogang, being a think tank guy now, is more worried about the longer term and more qualitative issues about China's growth. Then Jonathan, I don't know why, Jonathan, you're the only one that doesn't have black hair on the panel here. Maybe that's why. You asked a lot of questions about China's position in Asia, position in the world, which is the second half of the topic that is given to us. And then, of course, then we have the master. So I would leave Professor Liu to the very end and let him tell us whatever he want to talk about in the overall subject of China's trajectory and its relationship with the West. So, Jing, with that, let me first ask you a couple of simple questions, and of course, you can always talk about whatever you want, Jing. I never ever dare to tell Jing what to say or do, but anyway, usually she asks me questions in JP Morgan events, but today is a joint event between JP and Asia Society. I get to turn the table and ask her questions. Jing, you seem to feel relatively comfortable about China's economic condition today. That said, a lot of people are saying that China is really slowing. Are you worried? Are the numbers coming in that cause concern? What is the cause of the? Well, we all know the cause of the slowdown, but what are there some deeper issues that we should be aware of? And what if I were to ask you, as a banker, it's difficult. Look beyond 1 year. Look to 3 years. Where do you think China is moving? So with that, let's go into the first half, China's trajectory. Jing, you first, and then and Xiaogang, and then we'll go to Jonathan, finally, the master.
Great. Thank you, Ronnie. It's always great to be on a panel with you. And good morning, everyone. Ronnie, I should answer all your questions in 30 seconds or half a minute? Is there time
Yes, I'm
constraint?
generous. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll stop you when you go too long,
great.
so don't worry.
I think in a nutshell, the Chinese economy is beginning to develop into a two-speed economy. We used to describe the Australian economy as a two-speed economy, commodities and non-commodities. But in China, a similar phenomenon is actually happening as well. By the two-speed economy, I'm referring to the new economy and the old economy. New economy sectors are growing very rapidly: e-commerce, logistics, healthcare, education, services in general. And also you have the old economy sectors, which are actually experiencing quite a lot of overcapacity and are in desperate need of deleveraging. So you have an economy that's growing at different speeds across different sectors. Overall, we still have the 7.5% target set by the government earlier in the year. The premier recently reiterated his confidence that China can actually achieve that 7.5% target. We are in the same camp. However, different sectors and different industries will face different fortunes as the year gradually progresses. So what we're seeing today is that the Chinese economy is facing a host of challenges, especially in the old economy sectors. You know, we have overcapacity issues. The corporate sector has been increasing their leverage ratio in the last couple of years. However, we also have the bright spots in the economy. As we can see, the consumer sector contributed 76% to overall GDP growth in the first quarter of 2014, which is quite encouraging. The service industry, such as e-commerce, logistics, is growing very rapidly. Now, facing the leadership is a couple of challenges. Number one, they really need to maintain a very careful balance between maintaining growth and undertaking painful structural reforms. The growth imperative is important. We know they need to have 7.5% growth rate. In fact, the premier said there's a floor to China's growth of 7%. But in the meantime, the leadership also said we must have very painful structural reforms, which will necessarily lead to unemployment, lower growth in the near term. So how do they juggle these two completely different objectives? Maintaining a level of growth that's acceptable, and on the other hand, actually undertaking painful reforms in the SOE sector and the financial sector, which in the short term may actually drag down growth. So as we progress throughout 2014, I think we will see some kind of fiscal measure to help support the growth. Today, just this morning, about an hour ago, we just had China's CPI number coming out, which is the lowest in 18 months. That basically will give the government more room for further fiscal stimulus. But this time around, any stimulus program announced by the government will actually be quite measured and contained. They're targeting certain industries, such as low-cost housing, and certain types of infrastructure investments, such as railways, but don't expect anything on a large scale as we saw in 2009. So overall, I think in the second quarter this year, we will begin to see growth rates stabilize. The first quarter, we all know, some of the areas showed quite a drastic slowdown. But starting in the second quarter, given the government's mini stimulus program, we will see growth begin to stabilize. But more importantly, from our standpoint, the most important issue is not whether GDP growth accelerates or decelerates. It is most important to see the quality of growth improves. And in the meantime, painful structural reforms must be undertaken, even though in the near term, it may lead to lower growth.
Great, Jing. You did all that in 29 seconds. Tell me something. You contrast the new economy and the old. What will happen to the old with all the overcapacity, the steel plants and the cement plants and what have you? What will happen to them? Where will job creation be? Will the new economy create enough jobs to absorb all the young people that are entering into the market every year? 7 million university graduates every year. Right? So what will happen, Jing?
Well, you know, it's quite interesting, Ronnie, you mentioned 7 million college graduates every year, and indeed some of them have had difficulty finding jobs. And none of them, I could say, are interested in working in the so-called old economy sectors. They don't want to work in factories. They want to work for upstart internet companies, right? So the interest of the people entering the workforce is changing. They're much more inclined to work in the service industry jobs than manufacturing jobs. So what happens then to the industries that are experiencing a lot of difficulty, that have incurred a lot of debt, that are in massive overcapacity, such as the industry you mentioned, Ronnie, steel, aluminum, cement producing? I think at the end of the day, we need to let market forces take hold. You know, if these companies are inefficient, if they cannot generate enough returns on investments, basically the market will not give them the credit that they need to survive. Basically, they would have to go bankrupt, right? However, as we all know, market forces and government-directed lending may not be at all times working in the same direction. Some of these enterprises are still being propped up by bank loans, which they don't deserve. But I think in the end, at the end of the day, I do believe in the efficiency of markets. As the next few years begin to show us the government is really intending to close down some of the inefficient capacity. You know how much steel we make in China? It's 800 million tons. That's over 50% of global production. China makes 20 million tons of aluminum. That's 45% of global production. China also produces 20 billion tons of cement. That is 60% of global production. For a country that's China's size, with 22% of global population, we don't need all that basic material, right? That implies there's a lot of room for consolidation. There's also a lot of room for closures so that society's resources can be diverted from the old economy sectors to the new economy sectors, basically supporting industries that are fast growing and supporting industries that represent the future of China.
This next question is not from me, okay? It's really for some of you. You mentioned about bankruptcies. I think we see some bankruptcies, in these heavy industries, but not a whole lot in the real estate sector yet. It's not because of me. I'm not interested in real estate. But a lot of people talk about real estate. A lot of the people are interested to know about your view. Will real estate cause trouble? Will there be more bankruptcies in real estate? I always say that real estate company go bankrupt is the easiest thing. So what? You got hard asset there. They don't have market obsolescence. Just have somebody to take it over. So will that sector cause trouble, as many of the journalists sitting at the back think they will?
I think, Ronnie, you're in a much better position to answer that question.
You're the anchor.
than I am. But just very briefly, the Chinese property sector is actually experiencing quite a rapid transition. As we all know, ever since the property market was privatized in 1998, it's been one straight line up. That's been the asset class the Chinese population has come to trust and rely on because they've been making a lot of money every single year from investing in the property sector. So has Ronnie, building beautiful shopping malls everywhere in the country, from Shanghai to Beijing to Shenyang. So that's a sector that's been a huge wealth creator in the Chinese society. Now, we all know nothing can defy gravity forever. In the recent couple of months, we are beginning to see a slowdown in property transactions, even in the first-tier cities. Prices, as a result, are beginning to soften as well. As we all know, there's a lot of oversupply in some of the fourth-tier, third-tier cities in China. First-tier cities, such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, so far have held up pretty well. However, the overcapacity problem or overbuilding problem is beginning to creep into even the first-tier cities. Now, in the first quarter of 2014, we began to see transaction volumes soften, not just in the smaller cities, but actually in the bigger cities as well. And anecdotally, in the recent weeks, we're seeing large developers beginning to cut prices on their new launches because they're very eager to get rid of the inventory. Now, I think everything is cyclical, especially the property sector. As Ronnie has had so much experience operating in Hong Kong, China, I'm sure, is the first one to tell us this is a sector that's heavily cyclical. But in China, in the last 16 years, since the property market was privatized, there hasn't been a cycle. It's been one upcycle. So this is abnormal. So I would say, going forward, we will see transaction volumes in the second quarter continue to soften, which may lead to more price cuts. But in the medium to long term, there are some positive drivers for China's property market, especially urbanization. Think about it. You have 1.3 billion people in the country. 52% of the population currently lives in the cities. You still have another 15 million people coming into the city this year, another 15 million coming into the cities next year. There are another 400 million people that will become urban residents over the next 20 to 25 years. All these people need to be housed. So longer term, I think the property market still has bright prospects. But I must say, in the shorter term, nothing can defy gravity forever. We will see corrections. We will see bumps along the road. So we should all be prepared for it.
And China will let some of them go bankrupt now, finally.
Well, they should. Ironically, Ronnie, back in 2008, in the fourth quarter, we all remember the dark days during the financial crisis. Even during that time, very few property developers actually went bankrupt. China's bankruptcy law is still not complete, or it's not really, unlike in the US, you can operate under bankruptcy protection for some time if you're a corporation, and you can emerge out of bankruptcy once you've sorted out your financial difficulties. But in China, I think what you're referring to, bankruptcy, in my opinion, should be referred to as consolidation. Basically, large companies with strong financial resources will purchase smaller companies which are in financial distress. In China, we have tens of thousands of developers in China, which is too much. We need to have the large developers with large market share, with the land banks, with the bank credit backing to grow at a much faster pace. Smaller developers with dubious financial quality as well as dubious construction quality should actually be absorbed and consolidated into larger companies. So I don't think there will be a lot of bankruptcies per se in the Western sense, but definitely there's a wave of consolidation waiting to happen.
I love bankruptcies, as long as it's not my company. When they go bankrupt, the cities are strained in the finances because they don't have money to, they don't have land, they didn't sell land, so they are short of money. Then guys like me who can come in and buy the good land at cheap prices. And thanks to JP Morgan, who just did $500 million of bonds for me. Thank you very much, Gucho. I'm building my firing power. Okay.
One thing, if I may just say a couple words. Ronnie, on the property sector, remember, the fate of the property sector is directly linked to the health of the local governments. Local governments rely upon land sales for their fiscal revenue. Up to 30 to 40% of the local government revenue actually comes from land sales. So if the property market experiences a pretty drastic slowdown, we then may see difficulties in the local governments, right? So that basically adds more pressure, adds more urgency for the central government to undertake fiscal reform. Basically, local governments can no longer rely on land sales to generate most of their revenue. The central government needs to allocate fiscal revenue in a more even manner between the central government and the local government so that we don't have local debt issues re-emerging.
I love everything you've said in the last 30 seconds, especially the part that the city will run out of money. That's when they have to sell land and sell to them. I forgot to tell you, Jing, that later I'm going to ask the master to criticize everything that you're going to say. So disagree with what. Okay, Xiaogang, tell me, according to the question that you submitted to me, you talk about the growth model. Are they changing? Some of the qualitative, longer-term thing. Can you comment on that? How do you see Chinese economy? Will they be able to reform enough such that it can perhaps not have 8, 9, 10% growth every year, but at least a more steady one? More importantly, perhaps, is to avoid big problems, big dips and all that stuff. So what kind of reform do you see happening? What kind of changing of the economic model that China is needed right now? Comment, please.
Right. Thank you. One of the biggest problems for the Chinese economy is this business cycle with Chinese characteristics. When the central government tries to tighten, then the economy basically stops investment, like what we are seeing right now. And then the central government would worry about, social unrest, improvement. They will start stimulating again. Right. So this is the cycle which we are actually facing right now. But before we understand the cycle, we need to understand actually how the Chinese economy works. The 35 years of reform, basically, they allow the local cities, to compete with each other, compete for FDI, compete for GDP, And basically, the local governments then figured out that they are not just competing for performance, but also they're competing for how to change the rules of the game. Because that's the most effective way to gain, capital, people, whatever, And the first thing they do is to change the rules of using the land. If you change the farmland into industrial land, commercial land for commercial use, immediately you attract foreign direct investment, And if they change the rules for how to let the migrant workers to settle, you attract migrant workers. Cities like Foshan, we are studying, have 50% population from outside, And so the problem is, this competition really is so important for the success of China in the last 35 years. you know, and the competition, basically cities are trying to compete, they're trying to copy Hong Kong, copy Taiwan, you know, and that's why, you know, they all follow the Hong Kong, you know, transit development model, you know, build the real estate around the transit, you know, and that's very successful, right? But the only problem is that this competition sometimes it's not good. When they're competing on pollution, you know, when they're competing, you know, on the so-called the local government debt, you know, trying to build, you know, huge cities, new cities, yeah, and when they compete, you know, on like you know, in the past the low-wage model, you know, the processing industry, you know, build all this overcapacity, you know, so those problems. You know, the negative consequence of competition, you know, is really the, you know, what the central government has always been trying to do. Zhu Rongji has been centralizing the finance, you know, and the Zhu Rongji is actually taking power away from the local government to the central government, you know. And the worry I have is that, think about the Chinese growth model, you know, it has to have the balance. When you try, I mean, China is now, anti-corruption is so, important today. And the financial tightening, you know, think about it, the Chinese money supply has dropped from almost about 26% for almost 10, 20 years, you know, until 2009. And then it dropped today to 13%. 13%, you know, is almost halved the money supply. No wonder the interest rate, you know, now goes up. Shadow banking emerged, you know, and you know, all these real sectors, they fear problem, right? And this is the problem, you know, because when the center trying to control, sometimes it forget about the success of China's story is about the competition, about the incentives, about the locals, how to create jobs, how to create, you know, growth, how to create a lot of things. Yeah. And the worry I have, especially for the money supply, is that think about the Chinese property price has been going up. A lot of people think that this is bubble. But when I look at the data from Foshan, the Foshan per capita GDP is already $15,000, which is more than 1/3 of Hong Kong, you know, at the $36,000. But its property price is only like 15-20% of Hong Kong. You know, GDP per capita represents productivity, and then if the productivity continue to grow, the asset price of course will go up, right? If the asset price goes, the property, you know, in China, you know, 5 years ago is 1 million, now it's 5 million. That means that the money supply needs to support the transaction, and the transaction volume is going up, right? So I actually think that there is a shortage of credit for the real sector. But then the deposit rate, the interest rate, deposit rate is so low. So everybody thinks credit in China is cheap. But in fact, it's so expensive, especially when you see the money supply fall from 36%, you know, annual growth to 13%. So I'm really worried about this contradictions between the local competition and also the central, you know, the macro control.
Thank you, Xiaogang. Later, I'm sure that Mr. Liu will have a lot to comment on what you have just said. Jonathan, the Western media talks a lot about China. They have a lot of worries, you know, the private banking, shadow banking, now what we got, untrusted lending. Instead of going to the bank, JP Morgan, they go straight to each other, right? And so are you creating another triangular financial difficulty and all that kind of stuff? What do you worry about? I hope you are, well, I'm sure you are much more sophisticated than Wall Street Journal and New York Times and the like. But from an international perspective, you're the only non-black hair guy here. Tell us, where do you see China today?
Well, first of all, it's an unmitigated pleasure to be on a panel with you, Ronnie. It's been a while since I think it was Hayman Island. Or that was
Australia. That is.
Just to clarify, I'm probably more my father was born in Shanghai, so I'm actually a lot more Shanghainese than I am Western, and that's one of Shanghai characteristics, that globalization aspect. I obviously living in China for the last 20 years and in Hong Kong before that for the last 10. I obviously share a fair degree of optimism. I often tell people that you have to be an optimist to live in China. It's just too hard otherwise. And there are so many challenges every day, but then you look back and you see how far you've come. So and I think that reflects the great story that China has unfolded. And I think that's a story of recognition of human potential. That it's a story of urbanization, which is my particular interest and passion. And it's also, of course, with that, a story of specialization, of the growth of industrial capability, of gradual diversification of finance and channels, and the development of human technology as well. All of which stems out of, I believe, decisions that are based on hope as opposed to experience. That, as Deng Xiaoping said, it's an experiment not written about in books, and we must feel our way by crossing the river by feeling the stones and so forth. So we all sort of knew that there was an opportunity here, but nobody actually had a great idea about how to get it. And what has held China through a lot of this is the institutional trust that has been the foundation of this. And I refer to that, the trust within the party and between the party and the people. That has underlied a remarkable experiment in public policy, which I truly believe is never seen on the face of the planet. And that trust and that has to be reinforced and strengthened in the years to come as China's society fundamentally changes. That China for 5,000 years was a village society where you were defined by where you came from, Lao Jia, and that basically said, who you were and what language you spoke, where your relationships were, how you were educated, everything. And now we're essentially eliminating the villages. So we have villages and cities, but they're the equivalent of the walled city in Kowloon. I don't think that's a functional model. So we really now need to find a new model for China's self-identity, which is this values of what does it mean to be Chinese in the city. And, we know that urbanization changes people. It literally does. It makes them taller. It makes them fatter. It makes them healthier. It makes them smarter. It makes them talk differently. It makes them consume differently. So what does it mean to have 1 billion Chinese people in cities? And how will they think? How will they act? What will their relationship be to the governing authorities? And how will those governing authorities treat them? Those, for me, if anything, are the challenges. And we in the West, if you want to generalize, have seen this picture before. And so when migration happens, and it can go well or poorly. And particularly, I would hold up, the questions of Latin American cities and say, and if I want to sum it up, my nightmare scenario is, will China be the new Brazil? Essentially, we achieve the urbanization, but we do not achieve the sustainable economic productivity growth that should come with that, and that we have, in fact, of course, seen in other Asian societies, in Korea and Taiwan, and for that matter, Japan.
Wow. You mentioned China, the worst scenario is to become Brazil. The better scenario is to become what? Japan, did you say?
No, I think the better scenario is to become China. I mean, China doesn't want to be the United States. China doesn't want to be London or anywhere.
Even
China,
economically?
No, China wants to be a better China. I mean, China wants to be as rich as the United States. China would like to be as harmonious as Chinese Confucianist philosophy would allow it to be. China would like to be as technologically sophisticated as, I don't know, pick your favorite Finland. But it's all about being a better China. And for me, again, this dialogue is conducted at the city level, where it's, as a Shanghainese person would never dream of becoming a New Yorker, or for that matter, a Beijing-ren. Or people from Hong Kong want to have a better Hong Kong. They have no interest in becoming, for that matter, a better Shenzhen. I mean, this is in some ways, I think, a challenge, because we have to recognize that the space for the city is expanding, that we should be thinking more about clusters. We should be, if I boil it down to a nutshell, more inclusive. So, 包容性. This is basically the challenge for China, is the inclusivity of what it means to be Chinese.
Now I get you. Yeah. You talk about Shanghai, but of course Shanghai is a different breed of themselves. They look down on everybody, except they dare not look down on the Beijing officials, but at heart they look down on them. You talk about city clusters, huh? a lot of people say China will split up and all that kind of stuff. I'm just repeating what the Western press says. I don't believe it for a second, but what do you think? Will China have any tendency toward having regionalism that are too strong, perhaps?
Well, this, of course, was the challenge of mountain kingdoms, and I think it was Rao Shushi or something like that, who was the Heilongjiang party chief, who announced to the chairman that he was intending on developing his own economic policy, and the chairman invited him to Beijing, and Mr. Rao did not come back from that visit. So, I think that the central government knows quite well how to deal with local party officials who get too far out of line, and I think that is going to continue to be a challenge. But, that said, I don't see it as an insurmountable one in any way. I would never be one to say that I think China will split up. I do see more heterogeneity in the clusters. I think the clusters, as they naturally achieve scale, will have greater economic decision-making power and will already have their own way of doing things, whether it's through the influence of modern channels, through technology standards. If you want to sell telecom equipment already, you have to deal with many multiple standards across MPT branches in China. There's going to be, if I talk to Kangshifu, they have 40 different noodle standards and plants all around China to reflect local tastes, and so this is naturally going to happen. But it doesn't mean we won't have a strong interconnectivity, which I think is ultimately the solution to this issue of inclusiveness. That to create a common dialogue is essentially what the center has to do, and the best example of that and most visible one is high-speed rail. High-speed rail has had a huge impact on connecting the second and first-tier cities, but even more so on the clusters around the third-tier cities around the first-tier cities. So Kunshan is enabled by the high-speed rail. You can have a great Kunshan because it is a 15-minute commute to downtown Shanghai.
Just to remind everyone, the premier went to Chongqing and Wuhan recently, and at least Chongqing, I think maybe also Wuhan, and they have been talking about the clustering of the middle part of the Yangtze River and a lot of the cities in that areas, which have, for the most part, been a little slower in development in the last 30 years, is now trying to catch up. So that goes to your point. But Jonathan, I want you to address one other thing before I go to Professor Liu, and that is what about China's relationship with the rest of Asia? What about China's relationship with the rest of the world as China's economy rises, both geoeconomically and geopolitically? Some people are worried, neighbors as well as the United States. Europe is too sleepy to worry about anything right now. But anyway, can you comment on that, Jonathan?
Sure, and I came with a few numbers. The McKinsey Global Institute, of which I'm one of the directors, just came out with a report on global flows and sort of the importance of global flows to the global economy, and within that, which are the countries and cities that are most connected. And so just a few numbers here, that global flows are incredibly important. Flows of capital, flows of people, flows of information, flows of goods and services. They add up to about 40% of global GDP, which is up from 20% in 1985. And they account for anywhere between 15 and 25% of the growth in global GDP. So in other words, if you're not connected to global flows, you're essentially not participating in a huge and growing sector of the global economy. Now, the good news is that China is incredibly connected on some dimensions. It's notably connected on the goods dimension, trade in goods. It's practically the number 6 country in the world, and on finance. And so the tremendous volume of foreign direct investment into and now out of China in the form of sovereign capital is, again, in the top 10. On the other hand, China is woefully underconnected in things like people, very low migration levels, very underconnected in data flows relative to, and very underconnected in services, trade and services. So there's certainly opportunity for China to improve, and with that, it could create much more impact on the world, as is China's connections through goods, through capital, obviously have global multipliers. So I mean, when China, increasingly, when the world catches a cold, China sneezes a bit. When China catches a cold, everybody else sneezes quite a lot. And just lastly, again, the city's lens on all of this. Hong Kong is, in fact, the number 2, we can't say country, but region in the world that, in terms of being connected, right between Germany, which is the most, and the United States was the second. So in many ways, I'd argue Hong Kong is a model for how to interconnect, how to be part of global flows, which other Chinese cities could learn a lot from. And the only other Chinese city that comes halfway close to being in the top 10 is, of course, Shanghai.
So speaks the Shanghainese. Well, before I turn to the master, I just want to also welcome so many consul generals. I couldn't believe how many of them are here. I see Noda-san from Japan sitting at the back. I see Sagi Kani sitting, from Israel sitting in front, and with a Mexican CG. And I was told that there are others, New Zealand and Singapore, wherever you're from, you're welcome. Okay, Professor Liu, tell us why all of them are wrong. All right. From your perspective, which is perhaps much more insider, since you were a minister of a very, very significant commission. Now that you have left the government, he joined Chinese University, my university, and the head of your Institute of Global Economics and Finance, Professor Liu Bak-wai, who is on my board, chairs the chairs the remuneration committee. But anyway, Professor Liu.
Thank you very much. At first, I want to extend my hearty thanks to your invitation for JP Morgan Chess and Asian Society for the invitation. And I'm pleased and honored to be here with my panelists. And in general, I agree with what all you say, and they're very important points, and I share their thoughts totally, and I agree with their views. And to sum up, I think in general, everybody worries about the slowing down of the Chinese economy. And yes, the speed is going downwards, and it's slowing down quite a bit. But what I should say is don't worry about the speed. Don't worry about GDP. And please worry about sustainability. So that is something key important. The Chinese government taught and cultivated the whole nation recently. That is, please don't worry about the speed and the size and which one will want to catch up. Don't worry about that, never. And please worry about the sustainability. Please worry about the management of change and the quality of changes. And the second saying I want to quote is, life doesn't have to be perfect to be wonderful. China is still very good at a speed around 7% annually. We don't need double-digit, GDP growth, which caused a huge stir and controversials globally, because the mass investment, mass production, mass exportation, that with the outcomes that remaining us a tiny portion of reward, not adequate enough to invest our R&D, and not enough to kill our pollutions and so on and so forth. So that is the general view. Second point I want to mention is that thanks to the new generation of leaders, I should say that great leaders are almost always great simplifiers. Recently, Xi Jinping mentioned and or warned the whole party and the public in general, saying that 10% for promises, 90% for deliveries. And he is absolutely correct. I totally agree with him. He mentioned 一份规划, 一份规划, 9份落实. Okay, the 10% in promises and 90% of deliveries. This is key important because he put a lot of stress upon the outcomes of reform and opening up. He put a lot of stress upon the outcomes, which is aligned with what Deng Xiaoping said at the very beginning of the opening up era. It ultimately reminded me of that quotation I do not care the cat is white or black, so long as it catches mice. So this is very important for China, and this is a good voice. And we are very lucky to have the new generation moving in line with what Deng Xiaoping said. Right. So talking about the implementation, what the Chinese government is doing is that, in my words, is 3 Gs and the 3 Ps. The first G is good governance. The first of its kind in Chinese history, the government set up the fully fledged goal of the reform in the next 10 years is not about the GDP, not about the size, but about state governance system and the state governance ability. They said we got to modernize these 2 things because this is the root cause of all the problems. We must overcome that and upgrade our governance level. So it's linked about how we can have better promises, how we can better our deliveries, as I mentioned earlier. The second G is growth with quality. So what kind of growth do Chinese actually need? So mapping the framework China needs to meet its new goals and challenges in next 10 years and beyond is key important. So we are very lucky, and I'm very optimistic on hearing that. Growth with quality, growth with justice, growth with the people's and the public interest. And the third G is very important as well. That is the global partnership. Chinese government provides new guidance, and it's a win-win friendly environment for global partners and the major stakeholders. People made a lot of noise about the disputed rocks in Chinese seas and the South China Seas and so on and so forth. But in my eyes, in general, why we haven't paid more attention to the recent changes of Chinese government attitudes, it's very inclusive ones. For example, China quickly grabbed the standard, PM 2.5. Originally, it's not coming from Chinese government proper. It's coming from the U.S. Embassy based in Beijing. It caused huge controversies at first. But in a few months, the China government realized it's good for our next generation and good for the people's interest. Especially there's some reasons behind. Even in Eastern Skirt in Beijing, there are a lot of international schools. They got to know what actually the weather is today, if it's good for external activities or not. So immediate China pick up that PM 2.5 as a benchmark, and now it's a nationwide monitoring system about that. And another thing is that the attitude changed towards the TPP, Trans-Pacific Pact, okay? Starting from May last year, China changed attitudes. China said, we are willing to study that. Though it's a little bit late, but anyway, we're not against the TPP. We want to study TPP, we want to study TTIP, but though we are still for RCEP, and wholly fledged, opening up framework within the WTO. That's the reason why we are for the outcomes very fruitful coming from Bali packages last year, by the end of last year. And this is great outcomes coming from 13-year-long efforts. Though it's painful, but we think it's very good. And also we are for FTAAP, and any multilateral or regional agreements, so long as it's beneficial to the globalization, we will welcome, we will study that. And though it's a very difficult or painful process to negotiate them back and forth. So global partnership is with us, and the Chinese government is ensuring the ownership and implementation, and through the participation of key stakeholders. So we promise we will see some changes in China in mechanism and create a new culture and architecture to allow the fresh blood to flow. Because by the end of the day, it's a talent issue. We do need quality people to master the new challenges and so on and so forth. Talking about 3 Ps, in my eyes, the first thing is price. It's essential to establish the pricing mechanism to make the market have a decisive role to play. This is the strong voice given by the Chinese government, first of its kind in history. Okay. Second P is pollution. The government painfully realized that it's an urgent role of government to play. It's very essential to establish the standardized system and goals to improve the implementation at sectoral and regional and nationwide levels. And through the global cooperation, like clean energy technologies from every corner of the world, we're willing to buy, we're willing to work with them, and to do more in that way. And it's closely linked to the Jing's points about how we react to the overcapacity lines of walks of lines and industries. I think there are 2 approaches. One is the M&A, the other is bankruptcy. For bankruptcy, it's easy to adopt because we already got to the law over there. The remaining issue is still implementation and deliveries. But the first approach is more constructive. That is M&A. To attain that goal, we got to open up more and open the door much wider to welcome the private sector and foreign institutions to think about the mergers and acquisitions. We got to think, recheck our thoughts about the rules and laws and market access and so on and so forth, antitrust laws, implementations, flexible attitudes towards that, so that we can set up a platform wide enough to welcome the investor. Last but not least is the presence of the modern education, modernization of education, including vocational schools, to train the people to adaptive enough for the new jobs created by service industries and retrained or readaptive to the new life. I think I will stop here. Is that okay?
Thank you, Professor Liu. I'm going to invite the 3 of them to comment on what Professor Liu has to say in a second, and then open it to the floor. I was told I only have 5 minutes. I thought I have another 11 minutes. But anyway, when you first talk about not size, not speed, but rather it is sustainability, I wasn't sure if you're talking about green sustainability or just economic growth model-wise and hence become more sustainable. Can I assume that you are referring to the latter more so? That it's just the sustainability of the growth rather than just the environment and the water and the clean air?
In many lines of walks of life, in China, so long as we can pinpoint to the sustainability issue. And so long as we can solve the key issues, then we will automatically see that we have a vast potential areas to develop and to give the investors new confidence. For example, in media and entertainment industries, we have 1.3 billion people. The box revenue of the tickets and the theaters and cinemas increased by 50% annually. The year 2013, last year, witnessed a 50% increase of the box revenue. That means in a few years we can catch up the US plus Canada. We are now the second largest, so long as we can do better for IPR in that areas, and so long as we can have an open mindset to make more, colorful and different themes of programs and projects on the stages, then immediately you can change. It's a sea changes of the whole story. So this is only an example.
Thank you. I invite Jing and Jonathan and Xiaogang comment on what Professor Liu has just said before I open to the floor.
So maybe, Ronnie, I will just carry on the theme that Chairman Liu just said about 3 Ps. The first P is pricing. I think what Chairman Liu was referring to is market-based pricing of all resources in the society. Because we all know in China, water prices are too low, which results in wastage. Power prices are too low, which also means state-owned companies can continue to use cheap power to produce excess capacity. I want to mention the price of money as well. We all know the price of money in China is incorrect in some cases. We have interest rates for depositors that are artificially low. We have interest rates to state-owned companies and to private companies set at very different rates when they borrow. I also want to say the emergence of the shadow banking phenomenon is a result of the lack of market pricing of money. If you look at the bond market, for example, in China, which is still very small, bond issuances only account for 8% of China's total social financing. So if you have a high-yield bond market, presumably a lot of the companies would go to the bond market to raise funds rather than having to resort to shadow banking to borrow money. And we all know market-based pricing is a lot more efficient than these private deals that are done in the shadow banking sector. So I would say, in addition to market pricing of resources, hard resources such as water, power, etc., we also need to price money in a more market-driven fashion. That will actually remove a lot of the inconsistencies and problems in the financial industry. And we see that happen gradually in the future because the Chinese stock market and bond market are crucial for China's overall growth. And I would say if prices are based on market-driven mechanisms in the bond market or in the equity market, I think financial resources can be allocated in a much more efficient manner.
Thank you. Dr. Xiao and Jonathan, either one of you, whoever go first. Jonathan?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I completely agree, of course, with what Chairman Liu was saying, that the point about don't worry about speed, worry about sustainability. I actually think that came from a speech by Wang Yang, and I read in his economic report to the cadres a few years back, 说的好就是快的前提。好就是快的前提. Good is the prerequisite for fast. So don't worry about you guys, all you guys are going to grow fast. What I want to see is you grow well. And grow well mean defined as productively, competitively. And he actually uses the language of competitive advantage. And I generally feel like what's economically happening in the Pearl River Delta is kind of a bellwether for the rest of China. And Pearl River Delta has the most migrants, has the most incidents of mass unrest, has the most pollution, has all of that great stuff. But it's also solving these problems. And so his commitment was to say we now need to solve the problems that we have created, and everybody has to solve them individually. So I think this understanding of of sustainability is, first, to your point, is much more than a green issue. It's a broader issue around social productivity and how people are treated, and that goes to this new emphasis on the China dream, sort of defining what does Chinese society look like. And there are very, very real externalities to not getting this right. If you do not put education in, if you do not put healthcare in, you will reap the benefit, the seeds of that in 10 or 15 years when you have 40% of your urban population disenfranchised, and that will create a long-term impact on the productivity of China, as well as a very short-term one in the failure of some cities. The United States is quite unique in its ability to bankrupt a city. Who would have, 1 million people, okay, sorry, no more fire service for you. We don't think that's going to happen in China, but the reality is that the cities are the safety net, and that is, if the cities are not not able to raise the financing to provide those services, that's where we have a real challenge. So this question of the financial system, I think, underlies quite a bit of that. And if I could just point to one thing, I agree that we need to diversify the channels, and I believe that the development of a municipal bond market in China is one of the world's great finance opportunities that has yet to be established, and it's fundamentally a systems problem, sort of creating transparency around the assets and creating a market for institutional investors. And the longer that we delay that, the more likelihood it is that we create unsustainable financial situations. And that would, for me, would be the big sort of issue, the linkage, if you will, between a lot of this volume and old business model focus on investment and land sales and the new challenge of productivity growth and creating a new society that includes and supports through social services. The mechanism, the turning point, is the financial system that supports or doesn't support the cities. And I would hope that the financial system can be reformed to do so.
Dr. Shah, you want to add anything?
Just very quickly, agree with Chairman Liu. Chinese people now are hungry for safe food and clean air. All this is thing. But I would also add that what we need is very specific reforms in changing the standards, in motivating companies and cities. But on the other hand, I think the macroeconomy should support that reform. We have so many reforms, anti-corruption, environmental, and the rising cost of labor. But when think about China. When I see inflation rates, is 2%. This is too low. Look, economy growing at 7%. And we have the inflation rate of advanced economies, which are in recession. So in a way, I think with so much reforms, China need to have a relatively loose macro environment to support all these reforms, which is actually on the right direction.
What about the question of job creation? Jing mentioned about 15 million people each year coming into the city, 7 million university students graduating every year. Size and speed takes care of that. So if it is not size and not speed, if it is qualitative growth, will it be able to keep social unrest away from us, Professor Liu, that we have young people enough jobs for them?
The latest census told us that so long as the GDP can grow at the 6.8%, still we can create every year 9 million jobs. And basically, it can match the requirements of 11 million. There is a gap in between, but anyway, it's not a conspicuous gap. And also we can through the training and cultivations and to do that. But by the end of the day, still you got to quicken the pace of the reform and opening up, so you can create more jobs from the service industry, and the modernization of the service industry is very important. We need the government to play a better role in take the lead.
So not size and speed, however, we still need roughly 6.8% growth in order to maintain the job creation.
That's for sure, yes,
okay.
yes,
Okay.
That's correct.
Professor Jesus Seade from Lingnan University, question.
Thank you very much. Very briefly,
Ladies and gentlemen, when the microphone gets to you, don't touch it. Don't touch the on or off. Just leave it alone, it will work.
Yeah, I want to come back to Ronnie. Thanks very much for this fantastic event. Come back to the question of lower growth. Should we worry or not? I certainly agree that the number itself is not an issue, that sustainability is a question. But I want to ask quickly, what does that mean, the sustainability? What does that mean? The fact of growing slower to me is not only okay, but it's natural, because China has to rebalance, right? Not because anybody's asking, but because it's the natural process. Income is going up, it has to develop its domestic market, and domestic market cannot grow at a fantastic rate of export markets. So that's okay. But the question is, let's link it to events within China. What explains the reduction in the growth rate? We have wages having going up, we have emerging labor activism in China, we have had signs of labor shortages, we have had the production chain being split and production being sent out to Southeast Asia and so on. All that is healthy and conducive to the rebalancing. But all that means incomes going up, costs going up, the loss in speed will be a real loss in speed, or will be coming down to a sustainable plateau, depending on whether you really take measures to develop the domestic economy. So there has been a reference by Professor Liu, for example, in particular, to will China manage change? But really my point is the change is not to come in the fullness of time as possible. I really see, China has imposed on itself a fantastic speed of everything changes every 2 years. And my sense is that the adjustments to recover, to develop the domestic market, those structural changes are needed in real time. Will China be able to, is that correct? Is that the appreciation of Professor Liu in the panel, that changes are needed in real time, otherwise the cost increases are going to strangle growth, perhaps even more? And secondly, will the changes be possible? On the labor side, I don't see a problem, because to the extent that you rebalance and you develop the domestic economy is more services intensive, is more labor intensive. Last year, growth came down to 7.5%, but urban employment was 13%, very healthy. So I don't see a problem on the labor side if you maintain growth, as Professor Liu says.
Professor Liu, you want to comment on that? And maybe Jing as well?
What is sustainability? What is the concrete meaning in China? Sustainability will be embedded in the continuous rise of productivity. And to attain this goal, we got to boost our innovation. How to boost the innovation in China? We do need a reform. How to reform and opening up well or better? We do need the governance, the better governance. So this is the sequence. We are doing our homework. About the timing, yes, I agree with you. It takes time, because the remaining issue of the reform and the opening up is not the easy homework. Okay, all the easiest and the tasty meat have been eaten up. Okay, after 35 years, the remaining issues are very difficult, and we're fully aware of that difficulties and so on and so forth. But I will tell you, fast food is convenient. Slow cooking like Chinese cooking is more delicious.
Jing,
I think unleashing domestic demand is of critical importance for China to sustain its economic growth. We're seeing that happen already, Ronnie. Consumption is contributing more to GDP growth than before. Investments in heavy industry is indeed coming down. I think this is a process called creative destruction. You have to let the old economy industry die before new economy industries can actually emerge. When I earlier said the Chinese economy is indeed emerging into a two-speed economy, if you look at the new economy sectors, mainly modern service industries, apart from the ones I mentioned before, such as e-commerce and logistics, we also have travel, entertainment, mobile internet becoming very important to the overall economy, not just in China, but also globally. Think about it, 35 million people from China come to Hong Kong every year. 100 million Chinese people travel overseas every year. China has indeed become the single largest source of outbound tourism already in the world. At the peak in Japan, there were only 16 million Japanese people traveling overseas. And you remember the heyday during the 1980s that really created a lot of huge buying power of the luxury goods industry overseas. But the Chinese outbound tourism is becoming a huge force, not just for the Chinese economy, but for Hong Kong and for the global economy. So I would say allow creative destruction to happen. Let companies that don't deserve credit not have that credit, but channel money and credit and support to the most deserving companies in the most deserving industries.
Well, also mind you, the per capita spending of Chinese tourists is higher than the German, the Japanese, Americans, and so forth. So they are not just quantitatively significant, but also per person. Dollars spent is very important. Time's up, so last one or two questions. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. On Xiaogen's point on, the tightness of monetary policy in China and the need for a more conducive, relaxed macro environment for reform. First, I really don't think that monetary policy is as tight. I think M3, if you look at nominal GDP, still below M3 numbers, and M3 are not even representative of the whole financial system in China. So first, I don't think it's tight. It's only tight for those who are over-indebted. And second, if you really have an even more relaxed macro environment, who's going to reform? If you have the liquidity available. So I would actually think that going back to the theme of the conference on cities in China, and you were mentioning about local governments, I really think they have to start competing with the right financial environment, not necessarily with an over-relaxed financial environment. So that's just the point.
Thank you. Yeah, respond. Finally, Andrew, after that, and that's it. We'll call it quick.
I think the investment community, the investment bank economists usually think no problem. They look at the macro data, no problem. But if you look at the micro level, ask the people in the business, especially the spread between the deposit rate and the shadow banking interest rate, you can tell, that, between 7% and 20%, that you have a problem. You have a shortage of credit, That's what I'm worried about. I agree with you. China should not give another big stimulus, but they should narrow this spread, which creates so much shadow banking, so much speculation, and people are not looking at the real business. That's the problem. People are just wait and not doing things.
Andrew, can you make it short?
Thank
Last
you.
question.
Yep. In less than 10 words, my question. But first of all, I just want to thank you, Ronnie. Just want to follow up on one of your most insightful questions, which is China's relations with the rest of the world. And I'm not talking about economics. I'm not talking about finance. And I'm talking about geopolitics. Now, America still remains the anchor of the world order, including economic order and the financial order. So how is China going to interact with that order? Now, my question, less than 10 words. What does China want, and does America get it?
Jonathan?
Yes, as the token American on the panel. But we do share an alma mater.
You're USC?
Yeah, Trojan Pride.
No wonder you're so smart. I finally figure out.
So, no, I think the short answer is again, China wants a better China, and no, the U.S. just doesn't get it, because like all great countries, they're very domestically focused. The view from, from the White House says Pennsylvania Avenue, DuPont Circle, somewhere out there in Manhattan, and then it kind of gets fuzzy. There's the Middle East, and it's the curvature of the Earth kind of gets in the way. And I think that is the challenge. It's sort of how does one bridge that gap and create the understanding? And so here we are in the Asia society. So the answer to your question is right here. We have the responsibility to close that gap and help the United States to get it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, one takeaway I have is the last 30 years, China has been growing by way of barbecue. Very quick and very fast and very big. But 炖怎么说? how to say it? No. 燉湯啊. Bracing, yeah. The Chinese way of cooking, thank you, ma'am, is bracing. So China needs to now brace its economy and its very aspects of it, and the outcome will hopefully be a lot more tasty. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. A big round of applause for the panelists.
This is sitting now, it's okay. Thank you.